Welcome to this episode of Summa Made Simple, in which we begin a series of questions around chastity and virginity and all the virtues and vices concerning chastity, basically the sixth and the ninth commandment. So the first of these has to do with question 151, which concerns chastity, and it poses four questions. We shall only go into three of them. We'll go into the first, the second, and the fourth. We shall skip the third one. So the first question about chastity poses the question whether chastity is a virtue. Now, before I proceed to the different objections, I wanted to quickly jump to the actual section where St. Thomas gives his response about what chastity is, where it gets its name from, and then we shall cycle back to the objections and to the responses. I think that approach will shed a little bit more light on this topic. So he answers that chastity takes its name from the fact that reason chastises concupiscence. You remember we defined concupiscence as that internal leaning, that internal desire, that internal, let's call it, inclination towards those things which in our nature keep us alive, especially food, drink, and sex. So chastity takes its name from the fact that reason chastises concupiscence, which, like a child, needs curbing, as the philosopher says in Ethics, Nicomachean Ethics. Now, the essence of human virtue consists in being something moderated by reason, as shown in previous questions. Therefore, it is evident that chastity is a virtue. Why does he give that answer? Why does he say that the essence of human virtue is something that is moderated by reason? Well, first and foremost, because reason is the thing which makes us human. The thing which distinguishes us from mountains or trees or animals or any other thing in invisible created nature is the fact that we have reason. So you could say, in that sense, reason is a thing which makes us specifically, distinctly human. So when we speak about virtues and when we speak about human virtue, that's why he says the essence of human virtue consists in being something moderated by reason. That's an important concept to keep in mind. Let's jump into the objections. Objection 1, it would seem that chastity is not a virtue, for here we are treating of virtues of the soul, but chastity seemingly belongs to the body, for a person is said to be chaste because he behaves in a certain way as regards the use of certain parts of the body. Therefore, chastity is not a virtue. What this objection is saying is, hey, didn't we just say that virtues have to do with the soul, and yet chastity resides in the body? So obviously chastity is not a virtue because it has to do with the body, not the soul. St. Thomas replies and says, chastity does indeed reside in the soul as its subject, in terms of it's the soul which performs the chaste actions, although its matter is in the body. So in other words, the soul performs chaste actions on the body. So think of it this, it's almost like, think of it as a carpenter in wood. The carpenter is the subject, the wood is the matter. The chair is the object. So in that, using that rough analogy, the reason is the carpenter then of chastity, and then the wood of chastity is the body. So that where chastity springs from, its wellspring is the soul, not the body. Its terminus is the body, but its wellspring is the soul. For it belongs to chastity that a man makes moderate use of bodily members in accordance with the judgment of his reason and the choice of his will. Second one, further, virtue is a voluntary habit as stated in Ethics 2:6, but chastity apparently is not voluntary, since it can be taken away by force from a woman to whom violence is done. Therefore, it seems that chastity is not a virtue. In other words, a few questions back we had said that the moral virtues have to do with the will. Don't have to do with the will, and every virtue is something that is freely wanted, freely willed. That's what this point is referring to. Virtue is a voluntary habit. So how can you say that a woman is chaste, that she has this voluntary habit, if she has been violated in some way and her chastity has been taken away by force? You can't then say she's practicing chastity in that sense. So the reply to that is, as Augustine says in City of God, So long as that woman's mind holds on to its purpose, whereby she has merited to be holy, even in body, not even the violence of another's lust can deprive her body of its holiness, which is safeguarded by her persevering continency. He also says in the same place that in the mind there is a virtue which is the companion of fortitude, whereby it is resolved to suffer any evil whatsoever, rather than consent to evil. The first one, the first point that he raises is what is very directly pertinent to this objection, and what is really important to remember, that as we mentioned a few minutes ago with the whole chair and carpenter analogy, chastity is first and foremost in the mind. So even if something is done to the body, which that person did not want, it means that their mind did not want it. And so chastity is maintained in terms of it being a voluntary decision and inner choice that they have made. It's still there, it's still working. Objection 3, this is a tricky one. This is a really tricky one. Whether there is no virtue in unbelievers, yet some unbelievers are chaste. Therefore, chastity is not a virtue. Okay, that's a tricky one. As Augustine says, it is impossible to have any true virtue unless one be truly just. Nor is it possible to be just unless one lives by faith. Whence he argues that in unbelievers there is neither true chastity nor any other virtue, because, to wit, they are not referred to the due end. And he adds in the same place, virtues are distinguished from vices not by their functions, but by their ends. What does he mean by this? He means that if someone does a good action, I don't know, you build a hospital, build a school, give money to the poor, donate a kidney, whatever it is, whatever good action you want to do. If the final end, the final goal, the final intention, terminus, telos, whatever word you want to use, if the final objective is not love of God, that is not a virtue. That's what he means by this point. Because the proper end, you remember we spoke about the good of reason a few questions ago. We said the proper, so good of reason, safeguarding the good of reason is in two shapes. Number one, choosing the correct end, and then number two, choosing the correct means to achieve that end. So if someone does, and the correct end of our will, of human reason, is always the source of that reason, which is God, nothing else. That has to be the ultimate end. So whenever someone does something with a different ultimate end, that is not virtue. That's what this explanation means. It has parts of virtue. It seems like virtue. It's got the appearance of virtue, but it's not properly speaking a virtue. It's not properly speaking virtuous. That is what this point means. Moving on to the second article, whether chastity is a general virtue. The main point which I found tremendous value in this question, and I'm even for the in the interest of time, I'm going to skip the objections, but I'll just jump straight to the I answer that section, which just has some huge gems, some really massive ideas and profound ideas to chew on. The question asks whether chastity is a general virtue. And let's just jump to the answer. On the contrary, Macrobius reckons it to be a part of temperance. By saying chastity is not a general virtue standing on its own, but it's a part of temperance. So St. Thomas goes into the answer. I answer that. This is where he starts to drop some gems. The word chastity is employed in two ways. First, properly, and thus it is a special virtue having a special matter, namely, the concupiscences relating to venereal pleasures. So venereal, the word venereal comes from the word Venus. Venus was in Roman mythology, was the goddess of sexual love. Secondly, the word chastity is employed metaphorically, for just as a mingling of bodies conduces to venereal pleasure, which is the proper matter of chastity, and of lust, its contrary vice, here's the gem, so too the spiritual union of the mind with certain things conduces to a pleasure, which is the matter of a spiritual chastity, metaphorically speaking, as well as of a spiritual fornication, likewise metaphorically so called. For if the human mind delight in the spiritual union with that to which it behoves it to be united, namely God, and refrains from delighting in union with other things, against the requirements of the order established by God, this may be called a spiritual chastity, according to 2 Corinthians 11:2. I have espoused you to one husband, that I may present you as a chaste virgin to Christ. This explains a lot of things about the image of the church being the bride of Christ, about the spiritual union between a soul and Jesus Christ, about why it is in heaven we do not get married. Why is there no marriage in heaven? It's because there's this spiritual union between the soul and God. That's what happens in heaven. So in that respect, marriage here on earth is a foreshadowing of what happens in heaven. The union here on earth between a man and his wife is a foreshadowing of the union between the soul and God in heaven. That is why in heaven there is no marriage. And people who practice celibacy here on earth for the sake of the kingdom of God, eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of God, as is spoken about in Matthew. God, which chapter of Matthew? It's spoken about. I think it's chapter 19 or 11. Sorry, not very good with the. I'm a bit sleepy today. The point is that there's something that happens in heaven which is mirrored here on earth, and then there's some people here on earth who choose to, or who receive the gift or the vocation or the calling to live their lives in such a way that it is a sign or a symbol or a of what, very directly, of what's going to come in the future. So in a sense, one could say consecrated virgins, monks, priests, etc., they are in a sense showing us how we are supposed to be or how we are going to be in heaven, because they're showing us this spiritual union, which is through a mirror dimly is seen in that physical union between a man and his wife, which is why adultery, fornication are such, they're serious things. They are serious, serious things, because in a sense you're destroying that image. A person destroys that image of that union between the soul and God. It's a caricature. It's an insult. It's a mockery of the union between the soul that the soul has with God, because that is supposed to be through a mirror dimly seen in a lifelong, eternal, well, eternal here on earth, lifelong, exclusive, faithful, fruitful union between a man and his wife, because all of those elements, lifelong, fruitful, exclusive, all of those transfer directly to the union between the soul and God. This is why this point is really important. It's something which I don't think we speak enough about, and not many people pay enough attention to it. And so, yeah, we have a lot of problems in the world today. But heck, even they had the problems in the world. But these problems are eternal, I guess. These are concepts which we need to keep going over and over and over again, because it's so easy to forget. Why? Because the pleasures of the flesh are so strong. The fourth article, whether purity belongs especially to chastity. We proceed thus to the fourth article. It would seem that purity. So, this article, and with this we finish this episode, he discusses the relationship between purity and chastity, and why they're not exactly the same thing, but how the two are related. And here we shall again jump to the I answer that section, whether purity belongs especially to chastity. But just to give us the general lay of the land, it's the first objection says, it would seem that purity does not belong especially to chastity. For Augustine says in The City of God that purity is a virtue of the soul. So, if purity is a virtue of the soul, according to Saint Augustine, it is not something belonging to chastity, but is itself a virtue distinct from chastity. Basically, if Augustine says purity is a virtue of the soul, then that means it stands alone. It can't be related to chastity in any way. So let's jump to the responses to these objections. Now that we have the lay of the land, meaning that based on the objection, we can deduce that purity is related to chastity. How are the two related? This is what St. Thomas says. I answer that as stated above. Purity takes its name from pudor, which signifies shame. Hence, purity must needs be properly about the things of which man is most ashamed, because the name purity comes from a word which means shame. Now, men are most ashamed of venereal acts, as Augustine remarks in The City of God. So much so that even the conjugal act, which is adorned by the honesty of marriage, by the integrity of marriage, by the virtue of marriage, is not devoid of shame. And this, so basically saying, even within marriage, which is a proper home, proper locus for the conjugal act, even there it is still not devoid of shame. There's still some kind of shame that is attached to it. And this, why is this the case? St. Thomas gives a brilliant explanation. And this is because the movement of the organs of generation is not subject to the command of reason, as are the movements of the other external members. You remember at the top of this episode, we said the thing that makes us distinctly human, the thing that defines us as humans, that separates us from the rest of visible creation, is the fact that we have reason, and reason can direct our members. However, when it comes to our reproductive organs, they seem sometimes, many times, to have a mind of their own, especially when engaged in the conjugal act. They're not subject to reason anymore at that particular instant. And that is really shaming, because it feels like for a few seconds or few moments, the person is not being fully human, because reason is no longer in the driver's seat. It is something else. Now, man is ashamed not only of this sexual union, but also of all the signs thereof, as the philosopher observes in Rhetoric 2:6. Consequently, purity regards venereal matters properly, and especially the signs thereof. So, not the act itself, but all the other physical, observable phenomenon which surround the conjugal act, because it comes with a whole number of other physical observable phenomenon around it, and purity concerns itself with those, and especially the signs thereof, such as impure looks, kisses, and touches. And since the latter, the impure looks, the kisses, the touches, are more wont to be observed, are more commonly, are more easily, are more likely to be seen, and they're more likely to be seen. Purity regards these external signs, while chastity regards rather sexual union. In other words, we thank God. We thank God that we're not yet at the stage in society, in our civilization, where you can just be on the street, taking a walk to the shops or around the mall, and you just find people engaged in the conjugal act just randomly outside, right? However, what you do have are the PDAs, public displays of affection, and sometimes they could go a bit too far. And we know that those things lead to the conjugal act itself. But those public displays of affection, we do see them more commonly. They're more they're more want to be observed. They're more likely to be observed. They're more easily observed. They're far more common around us. And its purity has to do with these. Purity regards rather these external signs, while chastity regards rather the sexual act itself. Therefore, purity is directed to chastity, not as a virtue distinct from it, but as expressing a circumstance of chastity. Nevertheless, the one is sometimes used to designate the other. So that's the difference between purity and chastity, and how the two things are related. And in our next question, we shall delve into virginity, which we shall discuss in 5 articles. See you next time.